From Recorded Future News and PRX, this is Click Here. Hey there, it's Dina. For the past month or so, something a little different has been happening around here. You may have noticed it in the stories we're choosing. Click Here has taken a step out of the podcast world, and we're returning to our roots, radio. We're now a 1-hour, once-a-week national show on public radio, which means what you're hearing isn't a preview, it is the show. Same curiosity, same reporting, but with some new voices from the team and some brand new investigations that we haven't done before. If this feels like the kind of show you want to listen to on your local station, you can help make that happen. Tell your local NPR station to add Click Here to their schedule, because the more places this show lands, the more stories we can tell. We really appreciate your support. You're the reason we've been able to expand the show and broaden the audience. So, thank you. It means a lot. And here's this week's episode. There's a moment that comes before resistance looks heroic, before the slogans, before the crowds start to gather, before anyone knows a story is even unfolding. It's the moment when someone realizes the system isn't working the way it should be. And instead of shouting, they look sideways. They notice the gaps, the workarounds, the places where power isn't paying close attention. That's where some of the most effective acts of defiance begin. Not with force, but with something even more powerful: imagination. This is a story about people who didn't have political power or weapons or leverage. They had something else. They had music and a willingness to do something that felt, even to them, a little reckless.
So when he asked me, my first reaction, I think, was, that sounds crazy cool. I'm in.
I'm Dina Temple-Raston, and this is Click Here. We tell true stories about the people making and breaking our digital world. This week, Karen Duffin takes us back to the Soviet Union in 1985, to a time when information didn't travel freely, when surveillance was constant, and when 4 American musicians decided to use the one thing the system didn't quite know how to control: music.
I remember thinking, we're musicians. Just creating a code in music would be the easiest way to go about this.
We first brought you this story in 2023, and now we have a bit of an update. Stay with us.
Meryl Goldberg was a conservatory student in Boston during the height of the Cold War. Her days revolved around her saxophone, rehearsal rooms, and the warm, familiar rhythm of the music she loved so much. But in 1985, Meryl found herself 4,000 miles from home, anxious and unsettled, stepping off a plane in Moscow. She was on a secret mission. So secret that not even the American government knew the real reason that she and her musician friends were there.
Yeah, so we land in Moscow and we get off the plane and people are talking in little microphones and we think, uh-oh.
Uh-oh, because the Soviet authorities seemed to be expecting them. She was there with a fellow musician named Henka Snetsky.
And they told us to get our luggage, but not go anywhere, to bring the luggage into the, interrogation room.
We were flagged. There's no question about it.
And sit with an agent.
They start going through everything, and I mean absolutely everything, and opening up every single thing we have.
Which was a problem, because buried in that luggage was something they didn't want the Soviets to find. If they did, Meryl and Henkus would be sent home or worse, because their visa applications said that they were part of a cultural exchange, a musical exchange. But that was just their cover. The real mission? They were there to track down members of a secret musical ensemble known as the Phantom Orchestra.
They were called the Phantom Orchestra because they had to play somewhat in secret, right? So if they had gone out and decided, oh, we're going to play in the park, they would have been picked up and arrested.
These local musicians weren't just performers. They were what was called refuseniks, Soviet Jews who had applied to leave the country. And in Soviet Russia, wanting to leave the country marked you as a traitor to the state.
Most of them had already been either imprisoned or beat up or had a lot of issues already.
Word of these musicians' plight had been passed through Jewish communities around the world and eventually reached Meryl and her musician friends in Boston.
So we first heard of the Phantom Orchestra through the network of people who were working in the 80s, trying to help people escape from the Soviet Union.
For Meryl, the pull was immediate, not just because she was a fellow musician, but because she was also Jewish. Her ensemble actually specialized in Jewish folk music.
The actual ask was to go over to the Soviet Union in secret, essentially, and meet with refuseniks, mostly, focus in on the Phantom Orchestra members, and to basically go in, find out information about what they were doing, who they were, how they wanted their stories to get out.
Their plan was simple: gather the musicians' stories and share them with the world.
In the 80s at that time, the more publicity a refusenik or dissident had, the more protection they would have from being imprisoned or beaten up or whatever would happen to them. But if the West knew about them, they had a better shot at getting out.
And most people would look at an issue like this and figure there's just nothing an ordinary person could do. But Meryl and her friends looked at their skills and they decided actually they could make a difference, even if it was a small one.
So when he asked me, my first reaction, I think, was, that sounds crazy cool. I'm in.
Saying yes, of course, was the easy part. What came next was harder. Get into the Soviet Union, slip past the KGB, find these members of the Phantom Orchestra, collect their stories, and smuggle them out without getting caught. 4 musicians against the KGB. And to help them prepare, they turned to a nonprofit called the Action for Soviet Jewry.
We had to have several months of, I would say, kind of a learning curve and figuring out how we would go in without giving up who we were.
And for weeks, they sat in the locked back room of the nonprofit, getting trained on what to do when they were inevitably followed or bugged. They also learned how to slip a tale, how to handle an interrogation. And then there was this one other tiny problem.
You can't just walk into the Soviet Union with a list of names and numbers of people who, are theoretically on their bad list. You need to hide this.
They needed a way to not just collect the stories, but also hide them and smuggle them out of the country. And as they puzzled over how to do this, Meryl suddenly remembered another moment in history, another time when a musician became a spy. Josephine Baker. That's her singing. Josephine Baker was an American who became a celebrity in Paris, a singer, a dancer, a bon vivant in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. She was famous for walking her pet cheetah down the Champs-Élysées. And when World War II came around, she became something else, a resistance fighter, or to put a finer point on it, a spy. She'd sing at parties, chat up important people, and then take what she learned about things like troop movement and supply lines and smuggle it out of occupied France by writing messages in invisible ink on sheet music. And Meryl thought maybe we could do something a bit like that by turning music into code.
I remember thinking, we're musicians. Just creating a code in music would be the easiest way to go about this.
Musical notes, of course, have letters assigned to them. A, B, C, D, E, F, and G. But that only got her partway through the alphabet.
With the regular notes, you only have A through G.
So she turned to what's called chromatics. These are half steps, essentially sharps and flats.
And using different notes where I figured out all 26.
And with that, she could encode names, addresses, entire stories into sheet music. Secret messages hidden in plain sight.
So if someone knew music, they'd look at it and they'd think, that's modern music.
Meryl picked up her saxophone.
I'll play a little bit for you.
There's actually a dissident's name coded inside those notes.
This one was intro to a new person that they wanted us to meet who was a musician. And it was for someone in Moscow.
So they had their code, and now they had to execute their plan. They would land in Moscow, make their way south to Georgia, which was still part of the Soviet Union at the time, and find members of the Phantom Orchestra. Which is how Meryl Goldberg, Hank Osnetsky, and 2 other musicians found themselves at the airport in Moscow being interrogated by the authorities. Once they got to the hotel, it was clear that the KGB was not finished with them.
We knew that the rooms were bugged. We could actually see the microphones. That was a no-brainer. We could see little microphones, like one near the phone. It was kind of obvious.
Strangely, that ended up being useful. At one point, they mentioned kind of casually to each other that the sink in their room was leaking.
And then when we got back from dinner, the sink was fixed. So that's how closely we were being monitored.
So they started trolling their minders, like they'd play Russian folk songs, but like slightly off key just to annoy them. But when they went outside, the KGB would follow them there too.
We would walk up the street and the last car on the block would flash its lights. And then we'd cross the street and then the first car on the next block would flash its lights. And then the same thing would happen on the next block.
And then, after a few days, they took the leap. They decided to try to track down the first member of the Phantom Orchestra, Issei Goldstein.
I had the directions to their apartment actually encoded in my music, and that's how we remembered how to get there.
They used their evasion training, ducking down alleyways, splitting into pairs, jumping on and off subways at random.
We're all going to get on the subway, and then we're all going to get off, and Rosalie and I are going to jump back on.
They did this for hours until finally they found themselves standing at the Goldsteins' apartment, who had no idea they were coming or who they even were. They knocked and held their breath.
Issei Goldstein opened the door.
First thing we say is, we think we've outwitted them, but, we've been interrogated. Tell us if you want us just to turn around and go away.
Issei waved them inside. Then his brother Grigory walked to the window.
There were 4 cars he pointed to. He said, these are all KGB.
And they laughed at us. Like, of course you're being followed. And please come in because it's way more important for you to come in. We need you to visit. We need you to tell our story.
That was Karen Duffin. And when we come back, Karen tells us about a secret concert with a Phantom Orchestra.
Probably the most profound music making I have ever in my entire life made.
This is Click Here. You're listening to Click Here. I'm Dina Temple-Raston. In the Soviet Union, asking to leave wasn't just about paperwork. It was a test of loyalty. And if you failed it, the system didn't arrest you right away. It did something more efficient. It froze you out. That's where the Goldstein brothers were in 1985. Musicians whose careers had been shut down, whose movements were restricted, and whose names were already known to the state. That's where Karen Duffin picks up the story.
The Goldstein brothers were not surprised by the surveillance. They lived inside it every hour, every day. The surprise for them was that anyone had shown up at all. They led Meryl, Henkes, and the others into a small living room, instruments stacked in the corner, sheet music piled on a desk. They talked about the orchestra, about being barred from performing, about friends who'd tried to leave and paid the price for it. It was a remarkable scene, really. At any moment, someone could burst in, take them all into custody, or worse. And yet, here they all were, 4 Americans sitting in a Soviet dissident's living room, because the people with the real power to help weren't coming. Over the course of the evening, members of the Phantom Orchestra showed up one by one. And after Meryl and Henkes collected their stories, the musicians, Soviets and Americans alike, reached for their instruments, slipping into the language they all understood: music.
So for the people there who had so much courage, and, were constantly battling, whatever was going to happen to them for their activism, playing music was the time when in their brains they could be totally 100% free. When we played together, we were free.
This is an actual recording of the Phantom Orchestra. For one night, in the thick of the Cold War, in a cramped Soviet apartment, American and Soviet musicians played together. They played klezmer music, that Jewish folk music Meryl and her ensemble knew so well. They played traditional songs, and then they played a song that crossed every cultural boundary.
I think Somewhere Over the Rainbow touched us in a way that I hadn't been touched before. And I think because, first of all, it's a beautiful tune in and of itself musically, but also the whole feeling of the song, Somewhere Over the Rainbow, and the hope in that. I remember just being transported, that it was this feeling perhaps of amazement, of relief, of immediate camaraderie. Probably the most profound music making I have ever in my entire life made.
The night ended and they said their goodbyes, and then the Americans returned to the hotel, where they stayed up until the late hours, translating every name, every address, every moment into their secret musical code.
It was really important to get stories out there. It means you exist and other people know you exist. If your story is never told, it's like it hasn't happened.
Once they were done, they collapsed into sleep, only to be jolted awake just a few hours later. They were ordered to report immediately to the hotel office. The Soviet authorities told them they knew about the visit to the Phantom Orchestra, and they were not happy about it.
And then tell us that we're flying back to Moscow. And they drove us for what seemed to be like hours and hours. And I thought, oh man, now they're really going to do it. They're going to lock us up.
Instead, they were taken to the airport, not imprisoned, but expelled. But there was one last test. Their luggage was seized and searched. Suitcases filled with all of that precious encoded sheet music. Meryl held her breath, kept her gaze steady, and then
they just hand it right back to me. Oh, it was just really fantastic.
They quickly repacked their bags, and they were marched onto a waiting plane. Back home, they kept their promise. They told the Phantom Orchestra's story in living rooms, in synagogues, on stages, at press conferences. Here's Meryl speaking back then.
Didn't feel like we were anywhere except in our own world of great music making, of great people. And we certainly learned that for all the courage in the world that we could have imagined, we found it, and people like these men, and people like the...
They organized concerts, created petitions, they lobbied American officials, and in the end, the pressure worked. 2 years later, many of the musicians they met were finally allowed to leave the Soviet Union. The thing is, none of this was inevitable. It would have been easy to say they were just powerless. But instead, Meryl and her friends took stock of their skills, they found their courage, and acted.
The powers that be try to suppress you, try to say, if you speak up, you're going to get in trouble. You know what? You're going to be in trouble if you don't speak up. So really, for me, the only choice is to speak up.
That was Karen Duffin. The technology has changed since 1985. The surveillance is quieter. The borders are more digital. But the question is the same. When a system decides who gets to exist and who gets to move and who gets heard, what do you do with the tools you already have? I'm Dina Temple-Raston, and this is Click Here. Click Here is a production of Recorded Future News and PRX. Today's show was written and produced by Megan Dietrich, Sean Powers, Erica Gaida, Zach Hirsch, and Casey Georgie. It was edited by Karen Duffin and Sarah Quevedo, and fact-checked by Darren Ankrum. Original music is by Ben Livingston, with additional music from Blue Dot Sessions. Our staff writer is Lucas Riley, our illustrator is Megan Goff, and our sound designers and engineers are Jake Cook and Jesse Neiswanger. Find us on X or Facebook at Click Here Show, or leave us a voice message at 661-5CH-TALK. Sometimes we'll turn those moments into reporting, sometimes into a conversation, and sometimes into a future story you'll hear on this show. I'm Dina Temple-Raston, and thanks for listening. Before we go, if you're curious about what a Click Here radio show sounds like, we're now a 1-hour, once-a-week show airing on public radio stations across the country. You can check whether your local NPR station is carrying it. Over 80 stations have already picked it up. And as always, if there's a question you can't stop thinking about, a story you believe hasn't been fully told, or if there's something in the digital world that just doesn't sit right with you, let us know. You can find us on X or Facebook at Click Here Show. You can leave us a voicemail at 661-5CH-TALK. That's 661-5CH-TALK. Or email us at clickhere@recordedfuture.com. Sometimes those messages will turn into reporting, sometimes maybe into a conversation, and sometimes into future stories you'll hear right here. In fact, if you send us something today, there's a good chance it could be shaping tomorrow's show. And finally, we want to pause for a moment to say thank you. Your support is why the show keeps growing and why these stories keep finding new listeners. And it means a lot to the Click Here team.